Wilada, hamba hamba muyang, nanda panguradan, tonjukanlah kasakuyan, Mothra.
Okay, I think we played enough of the Mothra song. I mean, I had to. I'm going to be covering Mothra today, so I had to play the Mothra song, right? The famous, or some would say infamous, song sung by the Peanut Sisters, who were a pop singing duo back in the 60s, who were cast as the twin fairies, the priestesses for Mothra. That song has become synonymous with the character, and something that when people think of Mothra, they immediately think of the singing fairies, and specifically that song. Which is funny, because I don't even think it's the best song associated with Mothra. I much prefer Sacred Spring from Mothra vs. Godzilla in 1964, but I digress. But anyway, welcome everyone to another edition of Kaiju Corner, where I will be finishing up my reviews of the classic Toho films, various monster movies produced by the same studio that gave us Godzilla, and other forays into the world of giant monsters and what other wacky creations they were able to give us. And the heavy focus in this episode is going to be Mothra, the second most famous monster under their banner, behind Godzilla, of course. And Mothra is the only monster besides Godzilla to have her own series. In the 90s, she would ultimately get her own trilogy. So Mothra's popularity cannot be denied, and I would be doing a huge disservice if I did not cover the history of Mothra through her films, the ones outside of the Godzilla series, because clearly she left a mark outside of her contributions to the Godzilla series. So Mothra will also be making her grand return in 2019's Godzilla King of the Monsters, so this is a very appropriate video to be making. And in addition to Mothra, I will also be covering a few other odds and ends of Toho films in the science fiction world that they did. Some lesser known ones that I think might be worth checking out. Who knows? Well, you all decide after you listen to my reviews. But let's get started off with Mothra, and we're going to get started with the one that started it all. 1961's Mothra, which I have on this DVD set that includes two other Toho films, The H-Man and Battle in Outer Space, two of their other science fiction films. Movies I have not watched, by the way. I've had these things on DVD forever. I have not watched Battle in Outer Space, and I have not watched The H-Man. I should probably get on that. So, needless to say, they will not be included in this review series, but Mothra is obviously one of Toho's great classics. Mothra would go on to become one of Toho's biggest monster stars. And why is that? Well, my opinion, I think it's because Mothra kind of broke a lot of the trends in the giant monster movie films that Toho was producing. They made a conscious effort in that movie specifically to make Mothra the good monster, quote-unquote good monster. Even though Mothra ultimately is destroying civilization, they make it clear that the monster's wrath is justified. Mothra is not killed at the end of the movie, so there's not that element of tragedy there. Mothra is able to go home and live in peace on her island at the film's conclusion. And ultimately suffers no comeuppance for all the destruction she causes, because as it said, the film presents it in a way where it's like, look, Mothra is just defending herself and her own culture and her people, and it's like it's a couple of bad eggs that ruin everything and bring down Mothra's wrath on people, which gives her a very godlike quality, especially in this film. And I also think it was a very kid-friendly film. There's a little kid sidekick that hangs around with the main characters. There's the investigative reporter who is the main character throughout the film. He's a bit of a goofball, a little bit more comedic than what we're used to in these type more straight-laced scientist or military characters we were used to seeing out of these films. The main scientist is also a bit sillier, has a bit of a running gag where he doesn't want to show his face to the reporters. The villain is very over the top, like just one mustache away from being Snidely Whiplash. Just this very slimy, greedy, sinister character that drives the entire story. And there's also a huge emphasis on music. Now, music was always an important part of Toho's monster movies going back to the original Godzilla, and the score that Akira Ifukube was able to give that film. And he did most of the monster films that Toho produced, but he was not there for this one. He felt that he could not write music with lyrics and could not do the Peanut Sisters justice, which again, to disagree with him, I call back to Mothra vs. Godzilla, where he did Sacred Spring. And actually, I'm not the only one that feels that way. The DVD commentary for Mothra vs. Godzilla, Ed Godzikowski, sorry, and Steve Reifel, the commentary they give pretty much says the same thing. So great minds think alike. And the great minds of Godzilla fans especially think alike. But anyway, so because I think this film is a little bit more family friendly, more focused on fantasy than science fiction, Mothra, there is a bit more of a mystical element to her, a bit more of a fantasy magical element. There's the small fairies who are never explained as far as how they exist. They're just two magical fairies on Mothra's island, and that's it. And they don't give any other explanation other than that. And they're the priestesses of Mothra's civilization. But in this movie, it is more fantasy-based and more focused on being more magical and whimsical than any of the other monster movies that had come before it, at least in Toho's library. And I think because it was so different, and because, you know, Toho was now in full swing in producing their movies in color, and Mothra is a perfect movie to have in color, I think Mothra was just a huge kind of, again, broke the mold, but also kind of a trendsetter in a way, and kind of geared, kind of changed the direction of where these movies were going to go, and allowed for more elements that could be incorporated into these things. They don't have to follow the same straight up formula every single time. And Mothra would eventually cross over in Mothra vs. Godzilla with the Godzilla series, and that would change the direction of the series even more, and really gear it towards the whole, like, hey, let's sell these things as like big like boxing fights or pro wrestling fights. Let's go that direction with it. And I think Mothra being in the more magical fantasy realm kind of opened the doors for they can go even crazier. Like, it's all right, we don't have to be so grounded and realistic. We can incorporate any crazy thing we want. And I think I would never say that the original Mothra is one of my favorites, although it was, interestingly enough, it was one of Ishiro Honda's favorites that he made. Director Honda, who directed many of the monster films from Toho. According to the biography that I read, and I referenced in an earlier video, one of Honda's dreams was that Disney would acquire the rights to the Mothra property and produce their own animated musical version of Mothra, which I hear that, and you know what? I would kind of like to see that. Not in CGI, like the current Disney movies are in CGI, and it's like, you know, not only that, it's like not the animation style I would want, it's also not tonally and writing-wise not the style I would want, where a lot of the movies that Disney produces today are very loud and very silly, like over the top and bombastic and just quippy and all sorts of self-referential and various other things. Mothra, I would like to be seen played with a little bit more of that Disney earnest, like old school. Like if an animated Mothra movie had come out during the Disney Renaissance and was made by Disney, I'd have been all over that shit. And I would love to see what Disney could do with the Mothra song and the big like Broadway style production number they can make out of that. But again, I digress. While I would never say that this movie is one of my favorites, I don't like it as much as Rodan, and I don't like it as much as the original Godzilla. I think it is a very fun movie. I think it's a lot of fun to watch. I think Mothra looks terrific. A lot of the special effects that are used to bring Mothra to life, I think Mothra looks amazing, both in the larval form and in the adult butterfly form. And I said there is something to be said for how cutesy Mothra is compared to a lot of the other monsters that came before her. You know, Mothra doesn't really look much like an insect. It looks like a bunch of golf balls, like puffy, like it looks like a big stuffed animal, really. Mothra is kind of adorable, but again, that kind of plays into the more peaceful nature of the character, and Mothra would, you know, ultimately be kind of the moral compass of the monsters in a way, which would play off in Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster. But Mothra is almost always on the side of good. The only exception I can think of is Destroy All Monsters. Every other Mothra movie, Mothra is clearly the good monster. And I guess it's good to have that in the series where you have Mothra, who's like the ultimate symbol of good. Where Godzilla, there's a lot more ambiguity, especially considering how he's portrayed. Most of the other monsters are portrayed as destructive forces of nature, but Mothra is more peaceful and a completely different side to how these monsters are presented. So what is the story of this wonderful fantasy film? Well, a bunch of scientists and reporters go to this, what is Infant Island, this irradiated planet that's been affected by nuclear tests, because that's how all these movies go. They go to the island, they discover the small fairies, and this lost culture of natives that worship this god. And we don't see the god until after stuff goes bad. The main villain of the film decides to kidnap the small fairies and put them on display as this huge attraction, this huge, big production Broadway act, very similar to King Kong in a way, where it's like he sees money-making potential from these small singing fairies, and he puts them on display, puts them on stage, forces them to sing for the audience's delight and for the money that they're going to be rolling in. And they sing the Mothra song there on stage, a very memorable setup where they're on the stage and they come floating down onto the stage on this little rig, kind of chariot thing that's set up. Very nicely produced. Although I do have to wonder, the fairies are so small, like what kind of stage audience, like what are you going to get out of like the small fairies? Granted, they are able to project very well, and they sing loud and they sing proud. But anyway, they start singing on stage and they sing the Mothra song, and that awakens, it hatches the big egg, the big Mothra egg, and you see the giant larval Mothra come out of the egg as the villagers dance and pray and sing around Mothra. And then Mothra goes to Japan to get her fairies back, because the fairies are like her priestesses. They are Mothra's really mouthpiece in a way, because as we see in future films, they actually translate for Mothra and convey what Mothra's feeling and thinking at any given moment. And they also are Mothra's most loyal supporters and followers, so naturally Mothra wants those fairies back. So the larva tears up through Japan looking through the fairies, and this evil business owner does not want to give up those fairies because they're his star attraction or whatever. Then you have a bunch of scientists and the reporter that I talked about earlier, the Bulldog, as he's nicknamed, and they try to get the fairies back. There's a little annoying kid running around that's also involved because fantasy, kid-friendly film, you got to have a kid character running around being annoying. It's whatever. It's part and parcel for these type of films, and it gets even worse with the camera series. But anyway, they try to get the fairies back. They keep failing, and there's also an interesting part of this film where some have interpreted this film as anti-American, because the villain is clearly less Japanese than all the other actors in the film, and the way he acts and his culture, he isn't from Japan. He's actually from a country called Rolithica. And the capital city of this fictional country is Newkirk, not New York, Newkirk. And very clearly it's supposed to be a stand-in for America, and I think for probably some social commentary going on there with American greed and various other things, but I'll let smarter people than me analyze all of that. As is, I think it's just a very basic greed parable, and not appreciating the gifts that nature gives you or various other things, and not appreciating a gift as a gift, and not accounting for the consequences that go hand in hand with trying to exploit the things around you for your own personal gain. It's a big budget version of The Singing Frog in a way, which is just a big One Froggy Evening, one of my favorite Looney Tunes shorts, which is the big greed parable that came out of the Warner Animation Studios. But anyway, Mothra, in a very memorable climax, destroys Newkirk City, and again, Mothra looks terrific. This version of Mothra and the one we see in Godzilla vs. Mothra in 1964, I think are the two best looking versions of Mothra, although we'll see how everything turns out in 2019. I think all the city destruction stuff is great, and all the monster attack stuff is great, and I think Mothra came off very well. You do get that memorable moment, which is now iconic for the character, where she gets attacked with the heat rays, and it's like, all right, we've killed her, we've got her. She spins the cocoon around the tower, and they think they've killed Mothra, but then she hatches from the cocoon, you get the big butterfly. One of the all-time great monster movie reveals of the adult Mothra, which you knew was coming based on all the promotional material. You know that we're going to get a big fucking butterfly out of this thing, but it's still a memorable scene, one of the highlights of the film, and then it leads to that amazing climax where Mothra is destroying Newkirk City. The good guys are able to get the fairies back in a very somewhat anticlimactic way, where the villain is killed off by his own citizens trying to get away with the fairies. And they save the fairies, and to alert Mothra and let them know we're giving the fairies back to her, there's a little bit of religious imagery where they use the symbol of the cross to kind of summon Mothra, and she's able to take the fairies back and go off to Infant Island and live in happiness and peace, while Rolithica has to, rebuild Newkirk City, which has been absolutely leveled by this butterfly. But again, I always liked that the monster got no comeuppance, because the monster is like, look, you all invaded our land, fuck you, you brought this on yourselves. and with your own greed and avarice and all that other nonsense. So, yeah, the original Mothra, I think, is a really good monster movie, and I think if you want to get your kids into the tokusatsu kaiju films, I think Mothra is a really good one to start with, one of the better ones. Son of Godzilla is one I've always recommended. It's like, look, if you want to get your kids into these films, I think Son of Godzilla is a very good one to start with. I think Mothra is also a very good one to start with, because it is more lighthearted, it is more colorful, and Mothra is very cute. I doubt any child would be afraid of Mothra, even while Mothra is destroying the city. I highly doubt, like, Mothra would actually scare children. And overall, it's just a nice, good, solid monster flick, featuring a very iconic monster that persists to this very day, and would ultimately go on to grow into an even bigger star from here. So 1961's Mothra, I think, is a really good film, and one that any fan of these movies should definitely check out, if you haven't done so already. Actually, one of my favorite viewings of this film, I saw it as part of a Riff Tracks live event, where they riffed the film in, excuse me, and actually had one of my favorite riffs I've ever heard on any one of these Riff Tracks or Mystery Science Theater type of things. I won't repeat it here, but it was very good. And I had good times in the movie. I got a kaiju movie, and I got to have the former hosts of Mystery Science Theater riff the movie while I was watching it. So it was just best of both worlds. It was great. So yeah, Mothra gets a thumbs up for me. I think it's a really good film. Then we move into Mothra's later films. Mothra would cross over into the Godzilla series, appear in various films. Mothra vs. Godzilla in 1964. Also in 1964, Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster would also appear in Godzilla vs. Sea Monster. Although people seem to forget that Mothra was in that movie. I think that's very interesting. I mean, her role is very small, but she was in Destroy All Monsters. She was in, made her return in the Heisei series, got a reboot in the early 90s, 1992's Godzilla vs. Mothra. Had a brief appearance in Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla, but then the financial success of Godzilla vs. Mothra, it was the most financially successful of the Heisei films, which is kind of surprising to me because I think it's one of the weaker films, but I digress again. Toho decided to, once they wrapped up with the Godzilla series, they decided to bring Mothra as the solo star of her own series. And that's how we get the Mothra Trilogy. So after Godzilla vs. Destroyer, Mothra becomes the new tentpole monster for Toho. And that leads to the Rebirth of Mothra Trilogy 1, 2, and 3, which I own on Blu-ray, of all things. Yeah, in Japan they're known as Mothra 1, 2, and 3, but in the States, to avoid confusion with the original film, they renamed them the Rebirth of Mothra series, which I actually kind of like that title. It actually kind of makes sense, given especially how the first one plays out. Now, I know I mentioned that the first movie, the original Mothra, was very kid-friendly. These movies are also very, 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 very kid-friendly, to the point that it might annoy some people. They're very lighthearted. The main characters of these films are always kids, and there is a way more lighthearted tone than what we were getting even out of the 90s Godzilla films. And unfortunately, they don't yield the same success as some of the Godzilla films in the 90s did. And doubly unfortunately, they were kind of coming out side by side with the Gamera Trilogy. And the Gamera Trilogy just blows these movies out of the water. So it's almost like no contest. So, all right, which are you going to watch, Mothra or Gamera? I was like, I'm going with Gamera. It's kind of like what we're seeing now with Marvel and DC. It's like, gee, which movies do you want to see? I'll stick with Marvel. Their movies are better. Justice League was a pile of shit. Yeah, they're not that great, and that's unfortunate because I do think there's a lot of creative things going on there, and I think there's a lot of potential, but it just never really lives up to that potential, and what you get are just kind of three meandering films that are not unmemorable, but not very special either. And unless you're a completist, I don't recommend checking these films out. But let's start with the first one, 1996's The Rebirth of Mothra, which, in a very confusing bit, it does not dovetail off the continuity of the Godzilla Heisei series, which is surprising. I would have thought, it's the same design, it's the same exact Mothra design from those 90s Godzilla films, but for whatever reason, it goes off on its own timeline, which I think, to me, it would have made more sense to just dovetail off of the Godzilla movies and play with that. But what do I know? So Mothra is living alone on Mothra Island, Infant Island, whatever the hell it's called, and there's the two fairies who actually get names this time. In the older films, the fairies were twins that spoke simultaneously with each other, and they had telepathic abilities and all that, but they're really two characters in one. They were kind of like one spoke for the other, and they were both kind of treated as the same character, even though it's two separate bodies. Here, they get their own separate names, their own separate personalities, Maul and Laura. Maul being the kind of the leader-ish, more serious one of the two, and Lol being the more soft-hearted one. And kind of like, I guess you could say it's kind of like, I don't want to say it's like Chip and Dale, where Chip's the serious one and Dale is kind of the goofball. It's not quite like that, but it is. There's a clear, like, they wanted to give them distinct personalities rather than just treating them like straight up twins. And they're the two of the three last surviving members of their ancient species that was part of like the Mothra society. The third one is their sister Belvira, who is the evil fairy and flies around on her own little bat creature called Garu Garu, who actually changes designs through the three films as it gets damaged. Although, oddly enough, it doesn't get damaged in the second one and comes back in the third one with a new design. It's like, what the hell happened? But anyway, Belvira, I think, is a perfect example of everything that the series could have been and ultimately doesn't get right. I think the idea of an evil fairy to go up against them is actually a really good idea. Kind of give them like a main antagonist. And they could have done something interesting with that. Unfortunately, her motivations make absolutely no sense. She hates humanity, wants to destroy humanity, although we don't know why, and why she broke away from her sisters, and why she wants to stir up all this trouble. We don't know. It's never adequately explained what her motivation is. I know that's a cliche to use to knock a movie. It's like, what's my motivation? It's like, I literally do not know what's motivating her to do this. But in this movie, she plans to unleash Death Ghidorah, which is a black, four-legged, King Ghidorah-like creature that shoots fireballs, and it's there's an environmental message to this film as well, which kind of dovetails off of 1992's Godzilla vs. Mothra. But Death Ghidorah, kind of an interesting idea, I guess. It's not King Ghidorah, but it kind of created the idea. It's like, ooh, there can be different Ghidorahs, and I've always wondered if there was kind of this, kind of like How to Train Your Dragon. What if like Ghidorah was like a type of creature, like a species, and there were different types of Ghidorahs. Like there's a two-headed Ghidorah, and there's a sea serpent Ghidorah, and there's a ground Ghidorah, and there's a digger Ghidorah, or whatever. And then King Ghidorah is like the alpha. I was like, I wonder if that's an idea that ever got pitched around, but no, it's just a Death Ghidorah, and he's just a black four-legged Ghidorah, and there's nothing that special about the creature, but we do get kind of a Bambi-like story here where Mothra is caring for her egg, and her egg hatches prematurely, which results in the main Mothra that we're going to follow throughout the trilogy, Mothra Leo, as it would be called. And actually would get its name changed like a billion times. And following the evolution of this Mothra would just make your head spin. But this Mothra, because it was born prematurely, the larva has special powers, like it can turn invisible and shoot laser beams from its underbelly, which is kind of silly, but this was the 90s and all the kaijus had to have ridiculous beam weapons back then. This is where they were really pushing it, though. And the mother and the daughter fight Death Ghidorah, get their tails kicked, and the mother Mothra dies. So you get that Bambi moment where the baby Mothra Leo loses her mommy, and goes and spins the cocoon and becomes the adult Mothra Leo, which is a more powerful version of any Mothra we've ever seen before, and actually a very interesting design. Kind of goes against, you see it right here, it kind of goes against the classic design, but still looks like something that would be Mothra, going with like greens and blacks and various other things. And pretty cool design for this version of Mothra, I think. And Mothra Leo comes back as an adult, fights Death Ghidorah, is ultimately successful in vanquishing the beast, and Belvira's plans are foiled. Curses foiled again. So yeah, again, like a lot of interesting ideas here, but the story never really gets interesting, and it's a very largely forgettable film. Again, great new design for the new Mothra. Death Ghidorah, probably an interesting idea. Belvira, definitely an interesting idea, but none of it comes together in a cohesive way, and none of it feels it's not a film worth going out of your way to see, I guess, is the way to describe it. And that leads us into the second film of the series, which is kind of like an underwater adventure for Mothra, where a bunch of kids find this magical creature called the Go-Go, which has one of my favorite, like, stupid things I have ever seen in one of these films. The creature pees I'm not making this up. The creature pees, and the pee, like, heals wounds. So it's miracle pee. I am not making this up. It's the craziest goddamn thing I've ever seen. And this creature, Gogo, is this lost creature from an ancient civilization, kind of like Atlantis, but it's called Nili Kanai. And the kids have to take Gogo to the ancient Nili Kanai temple in the middle of the ocean to stop this creature that is called Dogora, who is a monster that would just recently cross over into the Godzilla series, getting a small cameo appearance in Godzilla Planet of Monsters, although very unspectacular appearance. But Dogora is a creature that spreads these little red parasite creatures called the Beerus that pollute the ocean and are killing all the creatures in the ocean, is going to ultimately take over the world. So Dogora is like this plague that's going to start at the ocean, then ultimately destroy the world. So they have to get Gogo to this ancient temple to stop Dogora. Now, Dogora, I think, is of the new monsters to come out of this Mothra series. I think Dogora is probably the most interesting. It's got like this very odd design that's almost like a stingray. It's like a dragon like head, and it's this blue like aquatic dragon, but its body is kind of shaped like a stingray, and it looks like it breaks against all the conventions of most other like water-based kaiju that I've ever seen before. I'm like, that's actually a really interesting design and really interesting power with the Beerus and everything like that. I'm like, okay, that monster's kind of neat. So as far as new monsters go, I think Dogora is way better than Death Ghidorah. Way more memorable and way more interesting. And okay, so you got these kids with the Gorgo and the Mothra fairies, and they got to get Gogo to the friggin' ancient Nili Kanai temple, and they're being followed by Belvira, who enlists the Marvin Harry of kaiju films, who are these two dumb, like, idiot adults that get roped into helping this evil fairy. They're probably stoners, I don't know, but anyway, it's very silly hijinks, and has at the end of it has a very kind of like kind of a poor man's Indiana Jones feel to it, where they're in the temple and all these like weird like hijinks and traps are set off and all these other things. So, but it's a very interesting setting, one that you don't normally see in a kaiju film. And Dogora, of course, kicks Mothra Leo's ass, and ultimately in the end, Gogo sacrifices its life to add its power to Mothra, and Mothra evolves from Mothra Leo into Rainbow Mothra, which gives it the additional power to transform into Aqua Mothra, which is the aquatic version of Mothra, which is very cool design. But again, you can see where the evolution is getting very confusing. And all these different versions of Mothra, it's like, God, they really wanted to sell some toys off of this, didn't they? It's great. But anyway, so you get Rainbow Mothra, which has more colorful wings, but other than that, basically looks the same. But it's able to transform into this underwater version of Mothra that's actually pretty cool and badass looking, but makes it more capable of fighting Dogora, ultimately defeats Dogora, and the day is saved once again. So Rebirth of Mothra 2, it's a lot more kiddie than even the first one, and a lot more silly, and the Miracle Pea is just downright hilarious to me. It's just the silliest thing ever, but I think it's more memorable than the first one. So if I'm going to pick a better one of the two, I think I would lean towards Mothra 2. I think it's way goofier, way sillier. Belvira's motivation still makes no sense, but I think it's a far more memorable film than the first one. I think is a lot more creative. So, you know, still not great, and I don't like give it a high recommendation, but I think of the first two, at least, it's the least painful of the two. Again, it's so unabashedly silly that I think it's worth at least one watch for how ridiculous it gets. But that leads us to the conclusion of the trilogy, Rebirth of Mothra 3, which should have been the best one of the three, given the direction that they went in. It's the darkest one of the three, has the darkest themes of the three, and it pits Mothra up against King Ghidorah. They actually, no Death Ghidorah, none of that shit. We're getting King Ghidorah versus Mothra one-on-one in a film. So this is, alright, so Mothra is broken out from the Godzilla series, and now we get King Ghidorah in his first movie outside of the Godzilla series. That's exciting enough on its own. And Ghidorah is, they really expand on what Ghidorah originally was in the 60s, where he was this evil space dragon that flies around and destroys civilizations because he's the god of death. They call him the King of Terror in this film. because I guess God of Death is too scary. But he eliminates civilizations, and it turns out he actually was the one that killed the dinosaurs and wiped out that whole civilization. It seems to be his motivation is just to cause extinction and genocide for no other reason than just because that's what I do. I'm an evil space dragon. That's what I do. And his plan in this film is to go back to Earth and wipe out humanity, and he's going to start by killing the children. He is specifically targeting the children, which is so awesomely dark. It's like, God, Ghidorah is evil in this thing. I love it. I love it. So on paper, this should be the best of the three. Kind of falls apart. I don't want to say it falls apart, but it kind of loses its way a little bit. King Ghidorah definitely elevates the film, and I love this version of King Ghidorah. I think the design is great, and I love that his motivation is just pure evil and just genocide, and that's all great. But you do get into a little bit of silliness. They kind of muddy the water with the canon a little bit with the three Elias sisters, as they're called, not for you WWE fans, not that type of Elias, but the Elias being the fairies in this world. Maul, Laura, and Belvira come across the Elias Triangle, which are these magic pendants that go into their swords and add power to the swords, and then the three swords can combine into one giant sword that supposedly gives them ultimate power, although it ultimately amounts to very little except saving Maul's life at the end of the film, but I digress. It's this big MacGuffin that they keep referencing and setting up throughout the entire film and has almost no payoff. It's just, they use it to save Maul's life at the end and then that's it. And it just felt like, did we really need to spend that much time talking about the Elias Triangle and all these magic pendants and who has the sword that matches the right pendant and blah, 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 all this other stuff. It was really just pointless, like, canon and world building that just didn't need to be there. It was just a pointless experience, I think, and just pointless filler. Then you get into the whole time traveling aspect where Mothra, realizing that she is not powerful enough to defeat King Ghidorah in the present, has to go back to the past when Ghidorah was a much weaker version of himself while he was killing the dinosaurs and must kill him in the past. Okay, that's an interesting idea, except the dinosaur puppets that they use are extremely tragic, like really bad. And keep in mind, this movie came out 5 years after Jurassic Park, so it looks even worse when compared to all of that. It's like, oh my God, I've seen direct-to-DVD movies with better special effects than this. They look really bad. I mean, so the time traveling thing is a really interesting idea, but it's not executed to the best of its ability. And it's ultimately pointless where Mothra defeats that earlier version of King Ghidorah, gets weakened and is unable to come back, but like the tail of that Ghidorah survives and eventually evolves into the full-grown Ghidorah that you see in present day. It's like, oh, so all that time traveling bullshit was just pointless. Okay, so it's nice to know Mothra died in vain, but I'm not really what happens. But there's also a few other things going on where Ghidorah, as he's kidnapping all the kids, because that's what he does, he kidnaps the kids, which is hilarious, but okay. So he kidnaps the kids and leaves them in this special magic dome where he's going to flood the dome and kill all the kids at once. I'm like, oh my God, that is so dark, so sinister. I love it. I love it. It's so great. Another thing that he's able to do is he's able to have mind control powers, because that's a power that Ghidorah should have. He has mind control powers, and he actually takes over Laura and uses Laura as his servant, although there's not really a great payoff to that, where it just leads to Laura and Belvira getting into a fight. And oh, by the way, Belvira helps the fairies this time for some reason. Again, what's her motivation? I have absolutely no idea. Why is she redeeming herself? I have absolutely no idea. It makes no sense. Other than, I guess she wanted to help her sisters, because it is established in the earlier films that she doesn't hate her sisters, but I don't know why Belvira does the things that she does. I don't know why. This character should be the best character in this whole trilogy, and instead I'm just confused by why she's even there. But yeah, so mind control over Laura has very little payoff as well. Does very little. It's just a confusing power for King Ghidorah to have that I don't even know why it's in the movie. Maul sacrificed herself to give her life energy to Mothra, to send Mothra into the past to fight that version of King Ghidorah. This is all very confusing, by the way. This sounds like a mess, and it kind of is a mess, but in the end, once we get through it all, a bunch of prehistoric Mothras cover the damaged Mothra in the past, with their special webbing, and then Mothra lays in hibernation for millions of years, comes back in the present day when the full-powered King Ghidorah shows up again. And this version of Mothra has evolved into Armor Mothra, which is the silver armor-plated Mothra that is way more powerful than King Ghidorah and defeats him easily. That's that. The fights in this film are also not that great. They're very one-sided. Like, King Ghidorah easily defeats Mothra in their first fight, which makes sense because Ghidorah is the villain. But then in the last fight, which is the big climactic battle, Armor Mothra basically wipes the floor with Ghidorah. It's like, I would have liked something a little bit more dramatic than that. But oh, by the way, this version of Ghidorah also has the weird power of shooting purple lightning out of his wings, which I think is being adapted in King of the Monsters for 2019, because it looks like Ghidorah generates thunderstorms everywhere he goes. So I think they're kind of like playing with that idea in the new movie, but it just seems weird to see purple lightning coming out of Ghidorah's wings. But anyway, there's a lot of weird stuff. It's very confusing. Oh, and this version of Mothra can also shed the armor and become Eternal Mothra, which is a very, very pretty and divine looking version of Mothra, but it felt kind of pointless to do like a full-on redesign that's only on screen for 2 minutes at the very end of the film. Maybe they thought they were going to make more movies after this. I don't know, but as is, that's the conclusion to the Mothra trilogy, and I think it's a very, very uneven. I think King Ghidorah does elevate the film somewhat, but there's so many, like, confusing elements that don't really gel, and nothing's executed as well as it should be, and everything's just kind of messy and weird, that it just doesn't really work that well as a film. Again, if I had to pick a best one out of the Mothra trilogy, I would probably go with the second one. Which, is, again, is a weird, like, kiddie film and has a bunch of stupid stuff in it, but at least the stupid stuff is memorable and I'm able to follow the story. Whereas Mothra 3 is this confusing, kind of overbloated mess, and Mothra 1 is just boring. And 2 is actually the most fun of the 3, so if I had to pick a favorite, I'd probably go with 2. But yeah, the Rebirth of Mothra trilogy, unless you're a completist or a huge Mothra fan, these films aren't really worth going out of your way to see. There's plenty of better options for kaiju films, plenty of better options for Mothra movies. Watch the original Mothra, watch Mothra vs. Godzilla in 1964, watch, I would even say Tokyo SOS is probably a better Mothra movie than any of these 3 films. But yeah, the Mothra trilogy never really did it for me, but it is historic that the trilogy did kind of set up Mothra as definitively the second biggest monster in Toho's library, because no other monster besides Godzilla got her own series of films. So, again, can't recommend those films unless you're a Mothra fan or a completist, but, you know, it is what it is. So, that concludes my discussion on the Mothra solo films. What about some other gems from Toho's library? Well, let's pull them up. What we got here? I got 3 more films I want to talk about from that were Toho produced. One of them I'm kind of cheating on as far as, because it's not technically a giant monster movie, it's more of a sci-fi horror film. But it's so good, I wanted to bring attention to it. And you can actually watch this film on Amazon Prime as well. It's called Matango, made in 1963, and proof that Ishiro Honda, the director, was very good at handling a bunch of different genres. He can do a good horror film. This film opens up with the last survivor, or the last person discovered of this yacht that got lost at sea and wound up deserted on an island. And now that I think about it, you know, you've got all these characters. You got the guy who owns the yacht. You've got the captain. You've got kind of this goofball character. You've got like the rich lounge singer character who's played by Kumi Mizuno. And you got all that going on. It's like, man, this sounds like Gilligan's Island almost. But anyway, so he's in a psychiatric ward, and he tells this whole story of how the ship got lost at sea, and how the people he was with ultimately succumbed to whatever this evil force was on the island. And that is the setup for Matango. It's all told in flashback, and we get to see this horror tragedy play out throughout the course of the film. Now, in America, this film got the very cheesy title of Attack of the Mushroom People, which, don't you want to watch a movie called Attack of the Mushroom People? Doesn't that title just scream, I have to watch this movie? But in the film, it's not, you don't really get to see much of the mushroom people in this movie. They're largely saved for the end, but building up to that, they get stuck on this island, which has this evil fungus on it, that as more and more people eat it, they become addicted to the fungus. And as they grow addicted to the fungus, the fungi grows and spreads on their bodies, and they ultimately morph into these mushroom people throughout the course of the film. And it's like one by one, more and more people are succumbing to temptation and slowly become mushroom people. Now, it really does feel like this whole movie is just one anti-drug PSA, but it's I think it's handled very well. It's handled very suspensefully. It builds great. It has the feel of like an old like haunted house movie. The way everything is handled, where you get these group of characters stuck in an enclosed space, and then like suspicions and tensions arise as more and more characters kind of butt heads with each other. There's an affair going on at one point. There's backstabbing and betrayal, and nobody trusts each other as they try to find out what is going on this island. They're being antagonized by this mysterious force that they don't know what these creatures are. I can see like elements in like John Carpenter's The Thing in this. There's kind of like the old Dark House, which is an old Universal haunted house movie. A lot of different things going on here. The Haunting, I guess you could also reference that. It pulls from a lot of different things and creates this very nice atmosphere, dark, suspenseful horror film. And it's like, wow, this is actually pretty good. And it all builds up to the end where there's one guy left and he stumbles across the mushroom people, which are made up of fully grown mushroom people, which are giant mushrooms, which admittedly look kind of silly, but and then the people he was with, and they're slowly becoming the mushroom people as they've got fungi growing all over them and everything, but they're having a fun party because they're eating all the magic mushrooms that they want. So again, it's an anti-drug PSA. And that's basically the movie in and of itself. But if you like horror, you like good old school suspenseful horror, I think Matango is a good one to go with, and I was really surprised by it. It's one of those movies I always wanted to watch but didn't get around to it until a couple months ago, and I thought, man, I enjoyed that. That was pretty solid. And again, a good example of what kind of a director Ishiro Honda could be, because he was very versatile, actually. It's kind of funny that he's known strictly for the Godzilla movies, but as you can see, like, even within the monster movies, he could do, like, Rodan and Mothra, which are two completely different films from each other, and he could do something like Matango, which is kind of a horror film, and he could do, like, teenage romance films, and he could do comedy films, and he could do all these different things. So Ishiro Honda is probably a more versatile director than he ever got credit for, but I thought Matango was, as far as horror movies go, was actually quite well made. And actually, and I talked about it with Space Amoeba, but there's a crossover with Godzilla eventually with Matango, where a giant mushroom tree is featured as one of the environmental hazards of the video game Godzilla Monster of Monsters. And there's these tiny little mushroom creatures around that attack Godzilla and Mothra as you play through the game. And that's considered to be Matango. So it's like Matango kind of crossed over into the Godzilla series in a way. I'm like, oh, that's neat. But Matango, yeah, I thought was a pretty good film, and I think it's worth checking out. And as far as giant monster movies go, maybe it's not strictly a giant monster movie, but there are giant mushrooms in it. I'll count that. It counts and belongs as part of this movie review series. So that concludes my review of Matango. The next film I want to talk about is Dogora, the Space Monster, which was sandwiched in between. The production of this film was sandwiched in between two Godzilla movies. 1964 is synonymous with Godzilla fans as being the year that Mothra vs. Godzilla came out and Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster came out, two of the biggest and most significant monster movies in the Godzilla series. And then in between, you got Dogora, the Space Monster, and all three films were kind of made one on top of the other and released very rapidly. So they have a lot of the same crew, same director. Ishiro Honda directed all three films. Same people worked on it. A lot of the same cast worked on all three films. And Mothra vs. Godzilla and Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster turned out to be two of my favorite Godzilla movies. So maybe these guys were just at their creative peak at this point. It's like, oh my God, they delivered two of the best Godzilla movies. Maybe Matango, or not, Dogora the Space Monster would be like this, one of the best standalone monster movies that Toho film made. It is not, sadly. It's kind of a dull film, and unfortunately, I think the biggest issue with the film is that it kind of makes a similar, some would call a mistake with Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, although I think Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster does a pretty good job with it, where the human drama feels completely disconnected from the monster action, almost completely, I should say. Basically, the human action is centered around a bunch of diamond thieves that are giving the police department a hard time, and it's like this cops and robbers, old school style gangster film, which could be neat. I like that aspect, but then they tag on a monster on it where this space monster Dogora shows up, which is a giant jellyfish, which actually looks pretty good and wasn't made not in the conventional sense that most tokusatsu films are made, monsters are made. It was I believe, how did they make that actually? Now that I think about it, it looked a bit more like a photorealistic jellyfish than you would have expected. So, but it wasn't a traditional like a puppet or a man in a suit or anything like that. Anybody got any information on how Dogora was made? Please post down below. But it looks very different from all the other monsters, so it's very unique in that aspect. But unfortunately, the whole crime drama with the diamond thieves and the monster don't seem to go very well together, whereas in Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, you had like this princess that was being hunted down by these assassins from her own country, and the way they connected that to the monsters by having her have her brain warped and making her think she's an alien prophetess that's predicting when the monsters are all going to show up. So there are connections there, and they do connect well enough to where both sub-stories are able to exist cohesively together, whereas here it just kind of feels like they were going to make a crime drama diamond thief caper film, and then they just tagged a monster onto it just because. And unfortunately, I think both ideas suffer from that. It's like, look, either make a monster movie or make your crime drama film. This half measure shit is just a problem. They actually made a similar mistake with the movie I'm not going to review as part of this series, but Goliath, and I talked about this when I talked about Atragan, but Goliath has a scene with a giant walrus in it that is so pointless that the American version cut the giant walrus out of the movie, and it just felt like they added it in just to have a giant monster in the movie and no other reason. And Dogora the Space Monster, which the space monster is supposed to be the main focus of the film, I think I probably would have preferred this movie it was just a crime drama gangster film, or just a traditional monster movie. As is, it's just kind of like these two things that are competing with each other for attention, and neither gets the focus, attention, or quality that they should. Unfortunate. Dogora, as a result, is kind of a forgettable movie because of it. And I think a lot of people kind of overlook it for that reason. And it's like, you're not missing a hidden gem by skipping Dogora. Although, again, Dogora did cross over into the Godzilla series with a cameo in Godzilla Planet of Monsters. So Dogora is now a Godzilla monster, interestingly enough. So he got his moment in the sun. A very small one, but he got his moment in the sun. But yeah, Dogora the Space Monster, not one of my favorites. But one that I liked even less than that, but one with a very interesting production history, is Daigaro versus Goliath from 1972. Now, this is one of those cases, kind of like Pulgasari, where the production of the film is actually more interesting than the movie itself, because it was actually supposed to be a Godzilla movie. And not just any Godzilla movie, but a co-produced Godzilla movie made in conjunction between Toho Studios and Tsuburaya Productions. Tsuburaya Productions was the production company established by Eiji Tsuburaya, who was the Toho's big special effects director during their golden age of kaiju films. Worked on a lot of the Godzilla movies, and when he went on and created his own production company, he helped bring Ultraman to life. So Tsuburaya Productions' greatest contribution to the genre was Ultraman. And this movie was supposed to be this big co-produced collaboration between Toho and Tsuburaya Productions, and the film was going to be called Godzilla vs. Red Moon, where Godzilla deals with, and that's actually another video I might do at some point, like the best lost Godzilla projects that never got made. But Godzilla vs. Red Moon was going to deal with Godzilla dealing with this evil monster that was going to reproduce and find its mate and reproduce, and Godzilla was going to stop them from reproducing. Godzilla was in full-on superhero mode at this point, so the other monsters were going to be portrayed as evil, but it was going to be a co-produced Godzilla movie, which would have been very interesting. Although I have to ask, if it's going to be Toho and Tsuburaya Productions co-producing a Godzilla movie, why wouldn't they make Godzilla vs. Ultraman, or Godzilla meets Ultraman and they team up? That would be the natural one to do, I think. That's just my opinion. But I guess they were too busy making, Toho was too busy making Zone Fighter. But along the way, somewhere in production, this Godzilla got dropped from the project, and this movie morphed and evolved into something completely different, which is Daigaro versus Goliath, which is a very stupid, kiddie, ridiculous monster movie where Daigaro is this goofy-looking, hippopotamus-looking creature that is raised by the people of this village when his mother is killed in a military attack, the mother being this stupid-looking cat thing, and with bad hair, bad 80s hair in the 1970s. It had bad 80s rocker hair. And Daigaro is raised by this village and learns to love humanity even though they killed his mom. And it looks like a big hungry hippo. It's the dumbest looking thing. It makes Minya look dignified. And the people of this village are threatened by a space creature called Goliath, which looks like Gabara from Godzilla's Revenge, yet somehow shittier, which is quite the accomplishment. So it's like Gabara, but super shitty version of Gabara. And Goliath is able to easily defeat Daigaro, who's not a trained fighter, and is just going to cause all the destruction it wants completely unimpeded. And Daigaro has to recover from his wounds and even get somewhat of a training situation, almost like a training montage before there were Rocky movies. Daigaro trains and ultimately comes back and defeats Goliath in this really stupid, kiddie, boring film that you can find on YouTube. I found it on YouTube. I'll post a link in the description if you want to subject yourselves to this film. But, I realize that a lot of these kaiju films are for kids, and I understand that, but this one pushes it to such a degree that it's just saccharine sweet and just really stupid. And like I said, the monster action isn't even that good. The monsters themselves look stupid. I can't get past, like, Daigaro looking like a giant hippopotamus. And the fights are not great. It's just a really bad, annoying, poorly made monster film that the only reason I'm even covering it is because of its production history. It's like, oh my god, this is supposed to be a Godzilla movie. It's like, thank god this wasn't a Godzilla movie. And actually, the Godzilla series may have dodged a couple of bullets here. Like, Dogora the Space Monster was the one bad movie of the three that were produced one on top of the other. It's like, well, thank god the Godzilla movies were the two good ones. And then you got this piece of crap right here where it's like, oh, thank god Godzilla's name wasn't attached to this thing. That would have been unfortunate, but yeah, Daigaro versus Goliath, not great. And it's funny because this is the same year, the year this came out, 1972. Same year that Godzilla vs. Gigan came out, which is not one of the stronger entries of the series. That movie's a masterpiece compared to this shit. Yeah, Daigaro vs. Goliath, skip it. It's terrible. One of the worst kaiju films I've ever seen. It's annoying, but if you want to watch it, I found it on YouTube, so have at it if you're so inclined to subject yourself to that. But that concludes part 4 of Kaiju Corner and concludes my reviews of the classic Toho films. Really wish I'd actually gone out on a higher note other than Daigaro versus Goliath of all things, but that was how I arranged it. I take full credit for that. But it was fun to go back and look at the Mothra films, especially the original one. I think Mothra is such a classic monster that I'm always happy to come on here and talk about one of the classics, one of the greats, which would be Mothra. But in the next 2 entries of Kaiju Corner, I'm going to be looking at a very different monster. You want to talk about child-friendly films, you want to talk about silly and ridiculous. It doesn't get any more silly and any more ridiculous than the friend of all children, the giant super turtle himself. Next time on Kaiju Corner, I will be talking about the one and only Gamera. I will be covering the original string of Gamera films on the next entry, part 5 of Kaiju Corner. That will be coming in January of 2019. So that is all I have for you now. Happy New Year to all you Kaiju fans out there. And join me next year when I kick off 2019 by talking about the greatest superhero of all time that is a giant fire-breathing flying turtle, Gamera. It's going to be great.